Procol Harum named after a cat, but it's misspelt. There was a breed cat called Procol Harun, and it was something was done over a phone, and it was misheard, and so they misspelt it, and then it stuck. They were formed from the ashes of a band called the Paramounts, who were a band from Southend-on-Sea in the South English coast, who had one hit called Poison Ivy. They got going about 1967 and released an album called Procol Harum. They then released the single, A Whiter Shade of Pale, which is one of the best-selling singles of all time, with over 10 million copies sold worldwide. And then they existed until 1977 and called it a day at that point, after which they had released 9 albums in total. Like a lot of other bands, though, they got back together in this case, in their case, in 1991. They released another album in 1991, one in 2003, and one in 2017. In 2022, Rucker, who was the only person who was actually a constant in the maelstrom of lineup changes, died, so they officially stopped. Hi, my name's Dan. So this was the first album by Procol Harum, but it's a little bit confused with there's 2 names for this album, and I'm going to explain why. But before I do that, I will just say Acclaimed Music sometimes does this. They have an album that's listed in their list of the 3,000 greatest albums of all time. But sometimes there's more than one version, and they tend to be quite inclusive about versions. And I then have to make decisions about which version am I going to listen to review. So, the provenance of this was released in the UK as Procol Harum, and then they released A Whiter Shade of Pale as a single, which wasn't on the album, and it was a huge hit. And then they released this album, but they added the track A Whiter Shade of Pale to it to release it in the US, and it was released under the name of A Whiter Shade of Pale, is a fairly obvious thing to do, given how big a hit it was. So I tend to try and review whatever would seem to be the most original or the first version, or if there are 2 versions, often this is a US-UK thing, I tend to try and review the home version when I can. I can't always get hold of the versions that I want. So sometimes when there are choices, I have to make these choices. So actually I am reviewing here mostly the UK version without Whiter Shade of Pale on it. So I'm not going to go into much at all about Whiter Shade of Pale. I'll mention it again at the end. So I would describe this as psychedelic rock mostly. They have been labelled as a band as being prog rock, but we're a bit early here in 1967 for prog rock. I know things like prog don't just explode out of nowhere, so there was definitely some lead up, but most people would claim that it basically started in about 1969. In fact, some people would say it was In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson was the first properly prog album. But there were albums that led up to that, and often labelled as proto-prog, and this is one of them. I would kind of more confidently talk about this as being mildly psychedelic rock. It's got a classical influence at times. It definitely feels like other late 60s rock. There's quite a bit of organ involvement, which definitely gives it that kind of feel. There's quite a bit of skill playing, which is nice. That's a good thing. The songs are about kind of vaguely hippie stuff. Some of them are more about life, and some of them are more story based. There's some that are kind of got imaginations in them as well. And stylistically, I think I'd kind of maybe say they're a bit like a rockier Beatles, to be honest. So they do have styles in here that are quite reminiscent or similar to that of the Beatles, around the same sort of time, but their kind of rockier bits go quite a bit heavier than the Beatles generally went, I would say. However, in the middle of all this style, there's a couple of tracks that are anomalies here. So there's Mabel, which is kind of a New Orleans jazz style, but kind of fairly comic track, and Good Captain Clark, which is more of a music hallish leaning, which is a kind of British, particularly London tradition of comic songs. And this use of these kind of comic song styles was a thing that was done in the burgeoning psych rock scene at the time, and it was, it's the sort of thing that the Beatles might have done, but there are other bands who did it as well. But I think Procol Harum particularly lodged onto doing this. In most of their albums, there's one or two that, in from my memory of them. What did I think? Well, I liked it. It's got a kind of distinct flavour to it, despite the fact that I've been saying it's similar to other things. It, it definitely has a feel that I like, and a feel that has got an identity to it. It's well done. It definitely feels like they're enjoying the music and celebrating the music in its own right. My favourite track is probably the last track, which is an instrumental, which is called Repent, Walpurgis. No idea why. And it's which has homages to Vidor and Bach in it. So I enjoyed it. And the score I'm going to give it is 7.7, which probably I would say would go up to a 7.8 if I actually reviewed the version that has Wash a Shade of Pale on it. But I haven't, so it's 7.7. That's what I think of this album. Please do let me know what you think of this album, and you can do that by leaving me a comment in the comments. And that's it from me for now.
Still scowling black, good Captain Clack must eat his humble pie. His bed is made, the colours fade, his eyes one swears are dry. The naked muse who sits and chews tobacco off